superior to me.
Yes! Yes!
I'm not getting any better, and this is your relax time. I'm gonna let you clear your head, man.
All right.
I wanted to thank you for the day.
Thanks.
You're a great ambassador to something that I love. Thank you for helping me make this a success. I'm eternally grateful. It's good to catch up with an old friend. I miss you, and thank you for giving me the time.
Thanks,
I
dude.
appreciate
Good
that.
seeing you, man.
It's great seeing you, too.
Thanks for coming to my house. First time.
It's beautiful.
First time.
2 weeks will be
And
back
golf
in
club.
there. Enjoy, man.
Thanks, man. Don't worry, I'll get your golf clubs.
Please.
The Miz is still a WWE superstar, but he has his eyes on the future. He's constantly trying to better himself. And I couldn't be more impressed with his desire to pass along things that he's learned in the WWE to future generations of athletes. And while the Miz's Tesla Model X Plaid is a fast car, look no further than the 2 child seats in the back and his constant references to being older and having a family, and you can see that his car represents everything in his life. While he may have lived in the fast lane, he's firmly rooted in the present, where his family and golf are the main drivers. Welcome to a place that drives me, my garage. Allow me to introduce you to the Mosler MT900S. Sticker price on something like this, $350,000. They actually did only make 35 road cars. This is like seeing a white spotted leopard shake hands with a bald eagle. The Mosler has tons of character, but I can't find where the trunk release is. To open the trunk is a bit of a magic trick. You gotta get in under the wheel well and pull this. This is where you would keep your groceries and your golf clubs and your suitcase. Yeah, none of those are gonna fit me. What drives me to want to own something like this? It's rare, unique. I really do enjoy exclusivity. That might be somewhere in here like a cry for attention. After that therapy session, I feel like I owe you money. I at least owe you a ride. Man, this thing is alive and it wants you to put your foot down. That'll raise your heart like a shot of espresso. And right now, I'm staring at the trunk release button. Yeah, there it is. You learn something new every day. Until next time, this is John Cena making sure you always ask, what drives you?
The year is 1568. Almost 8 decades of relentless conquest are drawing to a close. The Aztec and Inca have been defeated, spreading the Spanish Empire across the Americas. The generations born of the first wave of conquistadors grow rich from the torrent of New World silver, a wealth which brought with it increasing power. They would begin to question their loyalty to the Spanish crown. A king that they had never seen, ruling over a land 4,000 miles away that they had never set foot upon. Would they continue to pay a lofty tax to the God-fearing kingdom their fathers and grandfathers had fought for? A distant place to which they felt no real connection? As evidence of the colonists' brutality comes to light, religious propaganda floods Europe, embellishing and magnifying the horror of Spanish crimes. A phenomenon phenomenon which would come to be known as the Black Legend. A potent anti-Spanish narrative which would color the world's perception of Central and South America for hundreds of years to come, forming cracks in a kingdom already slipping into debt, losing itself to political turmoil, fighting off pirates, and flailing to retain control of its hard-won outposts. The New World would soon endure its final official Spanish conquests. It would mark the culmination of millions of lives lost in a long series of atrocities set across 2 continents, all for an empire now destined for centuries of further turmoil. These would be the last days of the conquistadors. Over 80 years in the New World, the conquistadors' influence had spread across the North and South American continents, as well as the islands of the Philippines and Guam. Their thriving colonies owing a terrible blood debt to a savage global industry built on silver and slaves.
At the height of the power, conquistadors made their presence known all over the hemisphere, really. From Florida to New Mexico, California, all Central America, the Caribbean, Venezuela, the entire Pacific coast, all the way to Argentina.
Spanish colonies were also established on crucially important locales in Asia and in the Pacific Islands.
They made their presence felt all over the map.
But with success came criticism. The ethics of stealing native land, of enslaving its people, a topic of fierce debate back in Europe. The souring reputation of the conquistadors would bring shame to the Iberian Peninsula. Those once lauded as brave crusaders of the New World, now casting an ugly shadow over King Philip II's reign.
The 1570s, if we're going to choose a moment, is probably the best time to say, here's where the era of conquest is done, and we're moving into another period of the colonial history of the Americas.
The Spanish monarchy, it's King Philip II ordered that the word conquest were not used by the Spanish administrators, because by the end of the 16th century, the word conquest had come to be associated with cruelties, abuse of the indigenous population, violence, and so on and so forth.
Conquistadors enjoy the benefits of lawlessness that came with the early years of the conquest. They were kind of like the opening salvo, the first wave. But in some ways, conquistadors outlived their utility to the crown. The crown tried to develop a much more direct control over the territories through the use of ample bureaucracies, thus wresting political control from conquistadors.
By the late 1560s, fierce indignation amongst conquistadors in Peru was rife. Many still reeling from the imposition of the new laws in 1542, which were designed to restrict their powers. This, coupled with ongoing pockets of Inca resistance in the mountainous regions of Vilcabamba, meant the situation was critical.
The Spanish crown sent a new viceroy, the Viceroy Toledo, to put things back in order.
Toledo arrived in the Andean region in 1569, bringing with him a strict new set of legal structures designed to bring order by strengthening the very institutions that were already suppressing Peru's indigenous people. But the newly appointed viceroy never intended to improve their bleak conditions. His only concern was the crown.
He organized a census policy to collect scattered groups of indigenous folk and move them to larger villages and towns, to establish new ways of gathering tribute and especially labor service to help keep the mines of Potosí and other mines in the region operating. The Spanish crown, they wanted to maintain the flow of precious metals and to protect that flow of precious metals. So they invested in governmental infrastructure, boats and navies, in building forts in order to maximize the income that's coming. So the Tulaló reforms, as they're referred to, is a case in which the Spanish imperial state, the colonial imperial state, adopts a series of far more rigorous policies of rule. Similar things were done in Guatemala and Central America. Similar things were done in Mexico during the second half of the 16th century.
Conquistadors resented those desires of the crown to control their moves, and in many times protested that they were not given the prerogatives that they deserve for having actually done the conquest in the name of the king at their own expense.
By the late 16th century, it becomes very rare for Spaniards to talk about conquests, even when they're going to places that they've never been before. Even though there's huge swaths of land that the Spanish have not conquered or even entered, there's hundreds of indigenous groups that the Spanish have never encountered. They no longer call any campaigns against those groups as conquests. They have shifted to calling them pacifications.
Meanwhile, other European nations were moving against the Spanish, eager to build their own empires. These jostling kingdoms were drawing in on Spain's overseas territories, coveting their wealth, snatching at the nation's power. Resentment of Spain's success aided the mission of state-funded Navy pirates known as privateers, sent to disrupt trade and ravage Spanish galleons, loaded with the treasures of the New World.
By the late 16th century, the world has changed. There are a lot more competitors in the Americas that want to claim land. And so the Spanish perception is that they have conquered the Americas, and they are now defending that from other Europeans.
By this time, France and England and many other European territories, they're starting to pay attention to what the Spaniards are doing in the Americas.
Increasingly, the English and the Dutch begin to insert themselves and effect trade between Spain and the New World.
Merchants started to make their appearance in the Americas to trade with Spanish colonists, who in many occasions they welcomed them with open arms because they provided the same goods, sometimes at a better quality and a much cheaper price than actually the Spaniards ever did.
There's a great moment where Francis Drake goes to Africa and manages to get hold of a cargo of slaves, which he then transports across the Atlantic to the Americas. And in Cartagena de Indias, he describes himself as being well received, despite the fact that Philip II has explicitly instructed people in the Americas not to trade with the English. And it's only when the ship is damaged and he has to put in at Veracruz for repairs before going back to Europe that the authorities in Mexico City are alerted to the presence of this English trading ship.
The silver extracted in the Americas was carried to Spain, became also a big target for English and French and Dutch privateers. They became the target of numerous attacks in an attempt to precisely seize this great wealth.
But the king's growing problems were not only limited to the attacks that Spanish ships were suffering in the Atlantic. Despite ever more crown-appointed viceroys landing in the New World, hopelessly attempting to claw back control, colonial reliance on Spain was dwindling.
As greater development of Spanish colonies and settlements in the New World take place, with the opening up of trade routes to the Far East and to China, And independently, a vast amount of wealth being created through the export of silver on the galleons and the establishment of livestock farming. The Americas become increasingly autonomous and independent and far less dependent on Spain. You get the development of a criollo society. In other words, a society of people who were born in the New World, who are natives there, who've never been to the Iberian Peninsula. They grow in numbers, but they also grow in wealth and power, and it becomes increasingly difficult for the Spanish who come across or sent across by the crown to run their territories in the Americas, to retain control. They need to negotiate and work with this indigenous, this American criollo elite. Below that level, there's huge amounts of intermarriage between indigenous and Iberian people. And of course you have the transatlantic slave trade from very early on, so black Africans. You also have large numbers of immigrants from the Far East, from Malaya, from China, from Indonesia. It's a multicultural, multi-ethnic world of growing power. That kind of growing autonomy and independence from the center is a kind of really crucial thing, I think, that spells the end for the conquistadors.
The colonies became more and more prosperous as time went by. We tend to think almost exclusively of the wealth that was extracted from the Americas and taken to Spain, to Europe, and to other places. I think we rarely consider the amount of wealth that was created through the labor of indigenous and African people that conquistadors and the children of conquistadors and colonists benefited from. Many of them continue living in the societies that they have helped to create. Many of them were wealthy, many of them inherited land and inherited possessions, and they were distinguished members of these societies. So the so-called achievements of conquistadors became an element of pride in this family sagas.
Trouble plagued every corner of King Philip's empire. Catholicism forever at odds with a growing Protestant faith in Europe. A religious dispute which would culminate in a catastrophe for Philip. His infamous Spanish Armada was intended to be the greatest fleet of warships on Earth, striking fear into the hearts of the Empire's enemies, a powerful emblem of New World wealth. However, the Armada would face an embarrassing and unexpected defeat by the English Queen, Elizabeth I's navy, in 1588. A highly symbolic failure, which would further feed into the growing anti-Spanish sentiments sweeping across Europe. A campaign of propaganda which would come to be known as the Black Legend, designed to deride and discredit Philip's empire.
Europeans in general, they were tremendously jealous. You can imagine. You know, they hear about this tremendous wealth that Spain has acquired through gold and silver and precious metals and even labor. These vast lands that they claim domain to. Spain becomes not only tremendously wealthy, but now it can build up almost an invincible military. It can build up an insurmountable navy. The Europeans look at this with great envy and great resentment because they now feel that Spain is rewarding the success over them and that their very existence is being threatened. And so what they do early on, as Spain's success continues to gain wider notoriety, is they begin to demonize Spain. All we have to do is look at the conquest. All we have to look at is the Spanish character. Spaniards are lazy, they are ignorant, and they engaged in the genocide of millions of people. And so was born the Black Legend.
The Black Legend, it's a myth that grows up slowly across the 16th century. It starts out in Italy, and it's the idea that the Spanish are particularly cruel, that they're violent, rapacious, and sexually incontinent. If you're an Italian, at the beginning of the 16th century, This is really very much the center of the intellectual world at that time. You know, it's where the rediscovery and printing of classical texts in places like Venice is proceeding apace. Spain is seen as slightly barbaric by comparison, less civilized by comparison, but Spain comes to dominate politically in Italy. That basically causes the Italians to develop these sort of unpleasant negative stereotypes about what the Spanish are like. And that just then simply grows and is built upon.
The best weapons of the Black Legend came from within Spain itself. Something like the short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. If you want one single piece of writing that helped create the Black Legend, that's it.
What they did was to take Las Casas' arguments, because Las Casas can be considered a great defender of the Indians in that regard, and they used Las Casas' arguments for their own purposes.
It takes visual form through the really extraordinary engravings of Dutch engraver and printer Theodore de Bry. So de Bry creates these illustrations, these etchings to accompany Bartolomé de las Casas' text. Vivid illustrations of horrific violence, of people having their hands cut off, people being fed to dogs, people being tortured through having their feet burned. These really kind of visceral images enter into the kind of propagandistic imaginary of people. And in the 1590s, that's again consolidated in things like the theatre. So the Spaniard on stage in early modern London becomes this kind of villainous figure.
As negative sentiment towards the Spanish hardened around the world, their empire would begin a period of decline, with King Philip a key catalyst in its deterioration. As the sun set on a 16th century defined by his kingdom's ruthless conquest of the Americas, the Crown's treasury struggled to balance the books. Fraught foreign policies expressed through misguided military endeavors had crippled their economy. The nation's reliance on a dwindling supply of American silver only added to the strain.
The 17th century is when things become a bit more glum, a bit more grim, with the decline of the mines of Potosi, decline of the mines in Mexico.
As the 17th century wears on, the silver remittances from the New World become less and less. There's a greater demand for silver in the Americas itself, and there are certain years when no silver fleet reaches Spain at all.
Also, that silver allowed Spain to carry out a very ambitious foreign policy that led to increasing indebtedness of the crown and to really declare numerous bankruptcies or the inability to actually pay. So the more silver that they had, the more they paid, the more they spent, and the harder it was actually to pay it back.
There's a massive economic depression in Spain, and there's a huge depression in the transatlantic trade in general. That, of course, begins to slowly drive the colonies in the Americas and Spain itself apart. They become more and more different. The greater self-confidence, the greater wealth and power of the colonies continues to threaten that kind of royal control.
Over the remainder of the 17th century, Spain and its colonies would drift ever further apart. The crown falling from the House of Habsburg to the dynasty of the Bourbons in the year 1700. An ancient family with a thoroughly different approach to running an empire. Under this new regime came a final, desperate grasp for control of the new world.
The Bourbons come in and they are frustrated by how ineffective the administration of the empire is.
They attempt once again to reimpose royal control in the Americas.
The entire 18th century has been characterized by many historians as a period of kind of reconquest of the Americas. Spain understood that it had to really determine its dominance in Europe. And the way to do that was to extract all of the possible resources that it could from its existing colonies. As one historian has described it,
the Bourbons, in the year 1700, an ancient family with a thoroughly different approach to running an empire. Under this new regime came a final, desperate grasp for control of the new world.
The Bourbons come in and they are frustrated by how ineffective the administration of the empire is.
They attempt once again to reimpose world control in the Americas.
The entire 18th century has been characterized by many historians as a period of kind of reconquest of the Americas. Spain understood that it had to really determine its dominance in Europe. And the way to do that was to extract all of the possible resources that it could from its existing colonies. As one historian has described it, juicing the Americas for everything that they were worth in order to try to bolster Spain's position on the international stage.
So what they try to do is to sort of enforce some administrative reform. They wanted to push manufacturing, they wanted to push technology, modernize Spain, continental Spain that is. But this is coming in practical terms in the new world at the expense of that autonomy that had been gained by the Creole population, and they weren't keen, obviously, to give back.
The Bourbons are very much focused on the extraction of this wealth and the creation of new tariffs and taxes and the monopoly of certain products. And that is going to create an element of dissatisfaction among the colonial elites. At a time in which the Atlantic, it's really boiling, let's say, with movements of independence and songs of liberty and ideas of freedom from Europe.
Too much time had elapsed from, that sort of very highly centralized control of the beginning, reasserting authority after that lengthy period where Creole population had achieved a certain degree of autonomy. It wasn't going to work.
The Bourbon dynasty are basically hamstrung by the resistance of the Criollo elites living in the Americas. That leads to a series of rebellions against Spanish control, and in the longer term, that eventually leads to independence movements of many countries in Latin America in the late 18th and 19th centuries.
So most of the countries of Latin America became independent in the 1810s or by the early 1820s at the latest. This is when Spain ceases to be a great imperial power and loses the empire that the conquistadors had won for it 3 centuries before. But when the countries of Latin America became independent, it did not mark the return to power of Native American peoples. Native American peoples remained and have remained since a minority in their own lands, a disenfranchised, impoverished majority.
August 13th, 1898. The crumbling husk of Spain's empire falls to the United States, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, lost in the Spanish-American War. One particularly effective tactic in breaking Spanish resistance had been U.S. propagandists' use of an archaic but still potent 16th century weapon: the return of the Black Legend.
The United States had extensive interest in the Caribbean in terms of sugar. The consumption of American sugar grew by about 400% or 500% in the 1890s. Americans became obsessed with consuming sugar. And certainly Cuba produced a great deal of sugar. The United States began to demonize the Spaniards again. And what did? They resurrected the Black Legend. All of these attributes that were given to the Spaniards by 16th century England. And they said this is why the Spaniards deserve to be overthrown in the Caribbean, using the same descriptions: lazy, brutal, and worst of all, Catholic, because there was a strong anti-Catholic element already present in the United States, which considered itself a Protestant nation.
"405 years had passed since Columbus mistook Hispaniola for an East Asian island. The course of billions of lives, changing forever in the moment the Italian mapmaker's eyes settled on the New World. A historic discovery which would launch Spain's expansion across America, bolstering an empire relentless in its ravaging of the land and the cruel treatment of its people. But how did this relatively small contingent of outsiders make such a significant mark on the Americas? As modern historians begin to pry open this question, a different picture of the conquistador begins to emerge.
So, how did they do it? We tend to fall back on this idea that, oh, they had guns, they had steel weapons, they had ships, they had superior writing technology, and a lot of these things are not as effective as we think they are. And are really kind of ways for us to sort of struggle with the explanation as to how this small group of people was able to conquer this larger group of people.
The feats of the conquistadors used to be seen as almost superhuman, as though they were almost supermen. They seem to speak to some essential superiority of Europeans over indigenous peoples, some cultural superiority, as well as a technical one, even a moral superiority. Without wanting to underplay the sheer bravery and energy displayed by the conquistadors, the result was a foregone conclusion. Victory was certain. The Spaniards, the Europeans, ultimately benefited from the fact that the Old World was a very disease-rich environment in which all sorts of horrible pathogens had been circulating for hundreds of years, if not longer, and where, as a result, European populations had built up immunities to those things. By contrast, the Native Americans had lived for thousands of years, essentially in a natural quarantine, separated from the rest of humankind by the vast expanses of the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west.
It's difficult to overestimate the impact of disease. This was cataclysmic, and I would argue that Spaniards routinely lost in their military encounters when disease had not already had a significant impact on the population they were encountering. So when we think about Spanish success, I would argue that we need to think about Spanish success in the face of a decimated population.
Also, we have to be able to appreciate the role played by local indigenous peoples in permitting those new colonies to be established. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we fall back on the old Spanish idea that they achieved miraculous conquests of empires of millions of people just using a few hundred Spaniards. How did they do that? Because Spaniards are superheroes and they had God on their side. And that's not an explanation that will hold up for us. So in explaining what really happens, then we have to go back and see how indigenous communities, one by one, made decisions to accommodate the Spaniards because they thought that that was going to be in their best interest.
So it wasn't that this plucky band of 300 Spaniards defeated the Aztec Empire. No. It was a group of several 100,000 natives and several hundred Spaniards who engaged in a battle, a series of battles, and were victorious.
Where we see Spanish successes, we see alliances with indigenous groups. Where they aren't able to create alliances, as in Yucatan, they fail spectacularly. And this is probably true in several of these arenas throughout the Americas, that for many people, it was not immediately discernible that the Spanish were the ones entirely in charge. What they would have viewed were these alliances. I think that it took some time, several decades, for Amerindians in different locations and in Central America to understand how Spaniards perceived themselves as being wholly in command of these military contests.
And so, in the end, the question should not be how did a few hundred Spaniards or a few hundred Europeans conquer millions and millions of people. The question should be, how did they come to present these events in that way? And is that really what happened? Because if it isn't, if those events actually involved a far more diverse set of actors, protagonists who were African and indigenous, in really more complex, messy encounters that lasted for many generations, then we don't need to come up with an answer to that first question. Then we don't have to worry about whether it was God or racial superiority or that their guns were really, really useful after all.
What then was the true cost of the Spanish conquests? The conquistadors set the fetid foundations of a new